So, good evening, and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury webinar, during which we welcome Rachel Kanter to deliver her presentation, Exploring Moral Injury in the Context of Civilian Intimate Partner Violence. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI. As tonight's webinar resonates deeply and directly with the aims, vision, and the purpose of the ICMI, I should just note that the ICMI is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. Each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. Lastly, let me just note that as with all of our webinars on moral injury, certain aspects of the conversation may evoke quite intense and personal feelings, particularly this evening if you've experienced intimate partner violence either directly or indirectly in your own life. Please exercise self-care and stepping away if you need to, and certainly do know that help is available if you feel overwhelmed. I'll ask Jane to post the link to lifeline-international.com and would certainly invite you to utilize those services and find some help near you if you feel you need it. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening, Rachel Kanter. Rachel is a researcher specializing in moral injury, particularly in the context of interpersonal violence. Her work explores how facets of religiosity and spirituality influence post-traumatic outcomes among both survivors and perpetrators. Her research has been published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence and the Journal of Religion and Health, and she's presented at numerous national conferences, including the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She's a student at California State University, San Bernardino, an intern with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. Rachel plans to pursue doctoral training in clinical psychology with the long-term goal of informing evidence-based interventions for individuals experiencing moral and spiritual distress. So it's my honor to welcome her to our ICMI podcast series. And Rachel, I'll now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. I really appreciate you all tuning into this webinar in which I'll be presenting my research on moral injury in civilian intimate partner violence contexts. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the International Center for Moral Injury for inviting me here to present today. I'm very pleased to share my research with you, and I do hope that this is the beginning of many productive continued thoughts and conversations on this topic. So as Dr. Powers mentioned, my name is Rachel Kanter. I'm currently an intern with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, who have been doing some really fantastic work on moral injury, including recently proposing a new definition of moral injury, which I'll introduce a little bit later today. I'm also currently finishing up my bachelor's in psychology at Cal State University San Bernardino, and I'm actually graduating tomorrow, which is very exciting. And I'm currently being advised by Dr. Christina Hasija, who's here today. She specializes in trauma and associated mental health outcomes among both military and interpersonal violence populations. I would like to give a special thanks to her and extend my gratitude to her. She's just been so helpful and encouraging throughout my research process. So thank you to Dr. Hasija. So briefly, I would like to first discuss my own introduction to moral injury, as I feel it has very much influenced my research goals and my thought processes on the topic. So on a personal level, I have known many individuals who've experienced interpersonal violence. So whether as children or as adults, I've known, for example, survivors of really terrible childhood abuse and of intimate partner violence. So when I first learned about moral injury in 2022, it was completely separate from any knowledge about its history or its application in military contexts. And so because of this, when I first read the definition and the common outcomes of moral injury, so for example, guilt, shame, self-blame, a loss of trust in oneself and others, and so on, I didn't immediately think of military service members. I thought of the survivors of interpersonal violence whom I knew. I actually saw just flashes of memories in my mind, recalling back to conversations I'd had with these survivors. So then when I looked to see whether there were any academic articles published on the topic, there were very few studies that had assessed moral injury outside of military or healthcare contexts. and only one had examined moral injury as a potential outcome of experiencing partner violence. So my primary research goal for the last few years has been to try and help fill this gap. So to start, I'd like to introduce moral injury. As many of you may already be aware, definitions of moral injury and of potentially morally injurious experiences have varied and developed over time, and there are still certain core concepts that remain under debate in the field. I do know that there are some people in attendance here today who may not be familiar with moral injury, and so I'd like to make sure we all start with some base level of knowledge here. So to start, moral injury refers to the lasting psychological, biological, social, and spiritual distress that can occur when an individual's deeply held moral beliefs or expectations are violated, transgressed. So it was first conceptualized by psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Shea based on his clinical work with Vietnam War veterans. And Shea described moral injury not as a mental disorder, but as a wound to the moral self, as a betrayal of what's right by authority figures in high stakes contexts, such as combat. So one example he gives in his book, Achilles in Vietnam, which is a fantastic read, comes from a veteran who mistakenly killed civilians based on faulty intelligence and was later awarded a medal for it. When this man was interviewed, he expressed feelings of rage and dishonor and shame because of this. So next, in 2009, Litz and colleagues published their seminal paper wherein they expand the definition of moral injury beyond betrayal in high-stakes contexts to include events where the individual perpetrates or fails to prevent acts that transgress their moral beliefs, which are often referred to in the literature as acts of commission or acts of omission, respectively. And while several others have also put forward their own definitions of moral injury, the most recent of these, as well as the widest in scope to date, comes from Vanderweel, Wortham, and colleagues from the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And they define moral injury as, quote, a persistent distress that arises from a personal experience that disrupts or threatens A, one's sense of the goodness of oneself, of others, of institutions, or of what are understood to be higher powers, or B, one's beliefs or intuitions about right and wrong, or good and evil. Now, this new definition allows for considerable variation in the types of experiences that could potentially lead to moral injury. And importantly, for the present research today, it explicitly allows for events wherein someone is victimized by another. Of course, I should note here that the relevance of experiences of betrayal and of victimization in relation to moral injury is something that is very much still debated, at least within the clinical psychology community. And there were even several talks at the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies in Boston last year, where these debates were directly addressed. And I must say the field appears to be very mixed at this time regarding the relevance of those experiences. I should state my bias, and so does my opinion, that experiences of victimization, betrayal by others are extremely relevant to moral injury. And I believe the research I'll present today will help to demonstrate that. So while there remains no clear consensus regarding what types of events are considered morally injurious, theory suggests that moral injury has two domains. There's this sort of self-directed or shame-related moral injury. The terminology depends on the researcher. And this refers to internalizing outcomes related to the potentially morally injurious experience. So shame, guilt, self-blame, a loss of trust in oneself, and so on. And then there's this other directed or trust in violation related moral injury, which refers to externalizing outcomes related to the potentially morally injurious experience. This might be anger, a loss of trust in others and in humanity, and feeling betrayed. Now with that, let's move on a little bit to intimate partner violence, which refers to any sort of violence, abuse, or coercion perpetrated within the context of an intimate relationship. And unfortunately, research finds that it is highly prevalent. So nationally representative research finds that lifetime experiences of IPV range from about 27 to 45% for women and 18.5% to around 38% for men. So what is the theory behind why experiences of intimate partner violence, whether one perpetrates it themselves or is the victim of it, might be related to moral injury? So first, the two subtypes of moral injury, that is either self-directed and other-directed, are often assumed to map onto the type of potentially morally injurious experience that a person goes through. So to illustrate, if a person were to commit or fail to prevent a morally transgressive act, say they accidentally or intentionally hurt someone, it is thought that they might develop self-directed moral injury. Likewise, if someone is betrayed or victimized by another, for example, if someone were to accidentally or intentionally harm them, then it is thought that they might develop an other-directed moral injury. And then meanwhile, we know that the most commonly occurring form of IPV is bidirectional, such that both partners are engaged in some type of and level of violence against one another. I should note here that there are a lot of limitations with this. The first is that the way that bidirectional is defined in articles can vary quite a bit. So some define it as proportional violence, wherein both partners are engaged in relatively equal levels of violence against one another, but others might define it such that one partner might be engaging in very high levels of violence, while the other engages in very low levels of violence, and that would still be considered bidirectional. So another limitation here is that we don't know the motivations behind the perpetration of violence. For example, whether or not someone engages in violence as a means of self-defense. But these limitations in mind, when we think about how an individual might hold these dual roles, where they are sometimes a perpetrator of violence, sometimes a victim of it, it seems to make sense that such an individual might experience self-directed moral injury as a result of perpetrating violence against their partner, and simultaneously feel other-directed moral injury when their partner perpetrates violence against them. Another reason these IPV experiences, both victimization and perpetration and moral injury, might be related is that we know they have a lot of outcomes in common. So for example, all three are associated with existential and spiritual conflict, with depressive symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and suicidality. And importantly, these IPV experiences and moral injury are also frequently associated with negative moral emotions, specifically shame and guilt, which, according to Bretlitz's and colleagues' original conceptual framework of how a moral injury develops, they identified these negative moral emotions as fundamental to how someone may develop a moral injury following their experience of a morally transgressive event. Now, another thing to note here is that even though there is this conception that personal transgressions lead to self-directed moral injury, while others' transgressions lead to other-directed moral injury, in the case of intimate partner violence, these lines are frequently blurred. So, for example, it is well established that IPV survivors often report outcomes characteristic of self-directed moral injury, of shame and self-blame. Meanwhile, some IPV perpetrators report outcomes that are reminiscent of other directed moral injuries, such as feelings of anger and betrayal. So with that, I'll just give you a peek into the studies that we're going to be discussing here today. The first study explores the role of moral injury in the relationship between intimate partner violence and psychological distress. From there, we'll move on to explore a little bit more specifically to look into moral injury and religious struggles among survivors, specifically of intimate partner sexual violence. And then the third study is a mixed method study of moral injury among survivors of intimate partner sexual violence. So the aims of study 1 were to examine the relationships among moral injury, IPV victimization and perpetration, and psychological distress. So given that these IPV experiences are associated with various constructs that often co-occur with moral injury, including moral emotions such as guilt and shame, we predicted that IPV experiences, both victimization and perpetration, would be significantly positively associated with elevated self and other directed moral injury. Additionally, given that IPV and moral injury are both consistently associated with various facets of psychological distress, we also predicted that IPV experiences, self-directed moral injury, and other directed moral injury would be significantly positively associated with psychological distress. And finally, recent research found that moral injury acted as a significant mediator in the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and psychological distress. Therefore, we hypothesized that we would see a similar pattern such that both types of moral injury would significantly mediate the relationships between intimate partner violence and psychological distress. So for our methods, we had 152 college students who were pre-screened to include only those who indicated that they had been in a romantic relationship within the previous year. And then for our measures, to assess IPV, we use the revised conflict tactics scale, which assesses both victimization and perpetration. And participants are asked to indicate how often an experience occurred within the past 12 months, following which we summed total victimization and total perpetration scores. We use the expressions of moral injury civilian to assess moral injury. An example of self-directed moral injury, an item on that scale is, I am ashamed of myself because of things that I have seen or done. Whereas other directed, an item is, I feel anger over being betrayed by someone who I had trusted. And then we use the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, which asks participants to rate the extent to which they have experienced these symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress during the past week. So this is some demographic information from the study. To note here, about 90% of our sample were female. And something that I thought was really important here is that 100% of our sample endorsed at least one victimization experience within the previous year, which is extremely high. And about 80% reported at least one perpetration experience. So violence was highly bidirectional in this sample. This is the result of the correlations that we ran among all of the variables. We found that all of our hypotheses were supported such that both IPV victimization and perpetration were significantly positively related to both types of moral injury and to psychological distress. And meanwhile, both types of moral injury were significantly positively associated to psychological distress. And something that I thought would be of note here is that self-directed moral injury was actually more strongly related to IPV victimization than to other directed moral injury. And these are the two mediation models that we ran. The first that you're looking at is the relationship between IPV perpetration and psychological distress. We found that both self-directed and other directed moral injury acted as significant mediators of that relationship. And interestingly, after accounting for those mediators, the direct relationship between IPV perpetration and psychological distress was no longer significant. And then interestingly as well, when looking at the model with IPV victimization as the predictor, we found similarly that after accounting for the mediators, the direct relationship between victimization and psychological distress was no longer significant. However, we found that only self-directed moral injury acted as a significant mediator in the relationship between victimization and psychological distress. Other directed moral injury was not a significant pathway linking those two variables in this model. And so some takeaways from this study is that only one study prior to this had found a relationship between moral injury and experiencing partner violence. So our findings extend that research. And this was the first study to examine moral injury in relation to IPV perpetration and to examine moral injury as a mediator between IPV and psychological distress. So where did I want to move from this? Well, following completion of the study, I had a few specific areas I wanted to explore further based on some of the studies I had read. First, I was finding a lot of research noting that intimate partner sexual violence can be especially harmful even over and above other forms of intimate partner abuse. So for example, IPSV is associated, as might be expected, with adverse mental health, suicidality, and death by homicide. And some recent research also finds that experiencing sexual violence that is perpetrated by an intimate partner is actually related to even greater rates of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder relative to those who experience sexual violence perpetrated by a stranger or acquaintance. In addition, research also finds that among survivors of intimate partner violence more generally, those who also experience sexual violence in addition to other forms of abuse reported significantly worse mental health as well. Meanwhile, research also finds that individuals who experience high levels of moral injury alongside high levels of struggles with their religion and their spirituality also report significantly worse mental health than individuals who report high levels of moral injury alone. So for these reasons, I wanted to look more closely at how specific facets of religiosity might predict adverse health outcomes among survivors of intimate partner sexual violence specifically. So we've already established how and why experiencing any kind of violence perpetrated by one's partner might be morally injurious, and the intersection of which may contribute to significant distress. Now, interestingly, research finds that greater spirituality and religious coping is related to positive post-traumatic outcomes among survivors of interpersonal violence. However, we also know that there are some consequences of religion as well. So, for example, when survivors turn to religious figures, there's some research noting that they face victim blaming attitudes in response. And unfortunately, when survivors experience these negative reactions to disclosing their assault, it's associated with greater shame and self-blame among them. One construct I was also interested in looking at is purity culture, which is a conservative Christian movement that emphasizes both traditional gender roles and abstinence via sexual shame. And according to a qualitative study among survivors of sexual abuse in Christian settings, it was linked to themes of self-blame and a loss of self-worth. So with that, the aim of the second study was to examine the relationships among intimate partner sexual violence, religious and spiritual struggles, purity culture beliefs, moral injury, and psychological distress. No known studies prior to this investigated these variables in combination or how they might impact psychological distress. So we hypothesized that increased intimate partner sexual violence would be positively associated with moral injury, with religious and spiritual struggles, and with psychological distress. We also hypothesized that increased moral injury would be positively associated with religious and spiritual struggles and psychological distress. And additionally, for survivors who adhere maybe to these purity culture beliefs, IPSV might trigger greater religious and spiritual struggles due to internal conflict between religious teachings and their lived experiences. And so we predicted that purity culture beliefs would significantly interact with IPSV to predict increased psychological, religious and spiritual struggles. Additionally, we hypothesized that religious and spiritual struggles would mediate the relationship between IPSV and moral injury. And finally, that moral injury, like we mentioned in the previous study, would mediate the relationship between IPSV and psychological distress. So our sample for this study were 210 women who were recruited through Prolific, which is an online sampling tool. And we limited participation to individuals who were located in the United States, identified as women and as Christian. For our measures, we used the Sexual Coercion Inventory Revised. And this asks participants to indicate whether a current or former intimate partner has pressured them to engage in sexual behaviors when they didn't want to. And so this measures total lifetime prevalence of IPSV. We use the same moral injury scale as in the previous study. We use the religious and spiritual struggle scale to assess religious and spiritual struggles. This measure asks participants to indicate the extent to which they've had each of the experiences. So some examples of that are questioned God's love for me, felt hurt, mistreated, or offended by religious or spiritual people, or questioned whether life really matters. For the purity culture belief scale, there are two dimensions, and so we examined those separately. There's the gender roles aspect. An example of that is women must be responsible for guarding purity because men cannot help themselves. And then there's the shame and guilt subscale, which is an example of you should feel ashamed if you have sex outside of marriage. And then we also use the depression, anxiety, and stress scale from the previous study to assess psychological distress. So the mean age of this study was 42, and there's quite a wide range. So our youngest participant was 18, the oldest was 80, and most were either married or in a committed relationship. In terms of religious affiliation, participants were largely Protestant, although a significant minority did identify as Catholic. And importantly, 79% of our sample reported at least one lifetime experience of intimate partner sexual violence, which I should note is a lot higher than observed in nationally representative samples. So all of our correlational hypotheses were confirmed such that intimate partner sexual violence was positively related to greater religious and spiritual struggles, to both types of moral injury, and to psychological distress. And in turn, religious and spiritual struggles was significantly positively related to both types of moral injury, to psychological distress. And interestingly, we did not predict this as one of our hypotheses, but we did see that religious and spiritual struggles was also significantly positively related to the traditional gender roles subscale of purity culture beliefs, such that increased acceptance of these traditional gender norms was related to greater religious and spiritual struggles in this sample. And finally, as might be expected, both types of moral injury were related to greater psychological distress. So what you're looking at here are the two moderation analyses that we ran, each with the different subscale of purity culture beliefs. So the model testing shame and guilt was not significant. So this was not a significant moderator in the relationship between intimate partner sexual violence and religious and spiritual struggles. We think potentially one of the reasons why we didn't see a moderation here is that a large proportion of our sample reported that they were married, about half. And so given that the shame and guilt subscale focuses on sexual abstinence prior to marriage, the relationship between this subscale and religious and spiritual struggles may be complicated by purity culture's framing of marital sex not only as permissible, but obligatory in many cases. So I'm currently working on a follow-up study to assess differences between married and unmarried survivors of intimate partner sexual violence to see how this might affect it. We did, however, see a significant moderation of the gender role subscale such that intimate partner sexual violence and the gender role subscale significantly interacted to predict greater religious and spiritual struggles. These are the two models looking at religious and spiritual struggles as mediators in the relationship between intimate partner sexual violence and both types of moral injury. So in both cases, we found that religious and spiritual struggles acted as significant mediators and that all relationships remain significant. And finally, you're looking at the mediation model of moral injury as mediators in the relationship between intimate partner sexual violence and psychological distress. Like we've seen previously, both types of moral injury acted as significant mediators in the relationship between IPSV and psychological distress, although I think I should note that self-directed moral injury was a much greater predictor of psychological distress in this model, like we saw in the model in the first study in the IPV victimization model. So some takeaways from this study: it was the first study to assess moral injury in relation to intimate partner sexual violence, and our findings suggest that intimate partner sexual violence predicts significant religious and spiritual struggles among religious women, and interestingly, that traditional gender norms may exacerbate religious and spiritual struggles among IPSV survivors. And so where I wanted to go from here is I was really interested in why IPSV survivors are reporting such high self-directed moral injury. We know from qualitative research among IPSV survivors that survivors often report themes of moral disgust with themselves and others. And again, as we've discussed previously, research commonly finds feelings of shame, guilt, and self-blame among IPV survivors. And so I was wondering, is there anything else that might be contributing to survivors' feelings of self-directed moral injury? And so the aim of our third study was to examine moral injury and post-traumatic stress disorder among IPSV survivors using a mixed methods design. Our quantitative hypotheses were the following: increased IPSV will be positively associated with both types of moral injury and with PTSD symptoms. And in turn, PTSD symptoms will be positively associated with both types of moral injury. And finally, that both types of moral injury will mediate the relationship between IPSV and PTSD symptoms. And in addition to these quantitative hypotheses, we also had some qualitative research questions. For example, how do IPSV survivors describe negative moral emotions such as guilt and shame in relation to their experiences? How do survivors describe internal moral conflict stemming from their experiences? And finally, how do survivors describe perceived betrayal by others? Our participants for this study, again, we recruited them through Prolific. Our final sample was 142 women, and we limited participation to those who were located in the United States, fluent in English, identified as women, and in addition, they had to pass 2 pre-screen items. So specifically, they had to answer whether things happened in the bedroom that they didn't want, and whether they felt pressured, unsafe, or afraid during sex with a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, or partner within the past 12 months. So every woman who was included in the study said yes to both of those questions. For our measures, we used the Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Scale to assess intimate partner sexual violence. Participants in this scale, participants are requested to indicate whether a romantic partner or an ex-partner of a relationship lasting longer than 1 month had engaged in each of the listed behaviors, yes, no, within the prior 12 months. So some example items were: made me have sex in front of my children or other people, accused me of cheating or not loving them when I said no to sex, or made me participate in sex acts or sexual positions that they knew I did not like. For moral injury, we used a different scale this time. This is by Litz and colleagues from 2022. We used the moral injury outcome scale, and we anchored instructions to assess unwanted sexual experiences within a romantic relationship within the previous 12 months. Participants first indicate whether they have had such an experience that violated their moral code, and they're asked to respond yes or no, and only those who respond yes complete the full scale. And another thing that's interesting about the MIOS is that it also assesses functional outcomes related to the assessed potentially morally injurious experience. And so we'll be able to look at that as well. And I should know that the MIOS uses a little bit different terminology. Instead of self-directed, they use shame-related moral injury. And instead of other directed moral injury, they use trust and violation-related moral injury, but the concepts are the same. And then finally, we use the PTSD checklist for the DSM-5 to assess PTSD. It's a 20-item self-report measure that assesses the severity of PTSD symptoms within the previous month. And we also anchored this to an unwanted sexual experience within a romantic relationship within the past 12 months. For our qualitative measures, we embedded 3 open-ended questions within the survey and told participants that they could write as little or as much as they wanted, or to skip any questions they didn't feel comfortable answering. We asked the following: sometimes when people experience unwanted or harmful sexual experiences in relationships, they can experience negative emotions like guilt and shame. Have you ever experienced these emotions in relation to your experiences? If so, can you describe how? Second, for some people, unwanted or harmful sexual experiences can lead to feelings of betrayal or disappointment in their partner or others. Have you experienced a sense of betrayal due to your experiences? If so, could you please describe how? And finally, some individuals experience distress when their actions conflict with their personal values. Have you ever felt distress or moral conflict regarding how you responded to certain situations in your relationship? If so, could you please describe how? So some quick demographics. Again, 100% of our sample were women, and the vast majority were either married or in a committed relationship. And these are the characteristics of the morally injurious events that survivors reported, as well as the functional outcomes. And so some really interesting results came out of this. So about 83% of our sample reported experiencing a morally injurious event, specifically one that was related to an unwanted sexual experience with an intimate partner within the previous 12 months. And participants largely reported that the most distressing aspect of this morally injurious experience was 28% said it was their own personal transgression that was most distressing. 24% reported that witnessing a transgression was the most distressing. And finally, around 25% reported that being directly affected by a transgression was the most distressing. So we see quite a lot of variance in terms of the most distressing aspect reported by these survivors. And next, when we look at functional outcomes, of the 119 women who completed the full MIOS, 0 had no impairment related to moral injury, 12% had mild impairment, 16% had moderate impairment, and the vast majority of women had either severe or extreme moral injury related impairment due to their experience. So looking at the correlations among the variables, we similarly found, as we had in previous studies, that all of our correlational hypotheses were supported, such that intimate partner sexual violence was significantly positively related to both types of moral injury and to PTSD, and that both types of moral injury were related to PTSD. And something to note here as well is that shame-related moral injury was more strongly associated with IPSV relative to trust and violation-related moral injury. Next, looking at the mediation model, we found that shame-related moral injury fully mediated the relationship between intimate partner sexual violence and post-traumatic stress disorder, and that we did not see this pattern for trust and violation-related moral injury. And I think as we move on to discuss the qualitative findings of this research, I think it might help explain why we might have seen this occur. So, for our qualitative findings, we had 3 core themes that emerged. The first of these was a theme of self-betrayal. And in this theme, many survivors described a sense of immense internal conflict that stemmed from choosing to remain silent in order to avoid confrontation and maintain harmony in their relationships. and participants reported that their self-silencing came at the expense of their personal values, leading to a felt sense that they had betrayed themselves. In many cases, this self-betrayal had significant emotional consequences. One survivor explained, "There were times when I went against my own values just to avoid confrontation. I've always believed in honesty and respect, but at certain times, I kept quiet about things that didn't sit well with me because I was afraid of rocking the boat. That inner conflict was exhausting, and I felt like I was betraying myself just to keep things okay on the surface." Participants frequently identified fear as the underlying motivation for actions that led to these acts of perceived self-betrayal. One woman said, "In the moment, I sometimes reacted out of fear or a desire to avoid further harm, which led me to act in ways that didn't align with my values of assertiveness and self-respect. For instance, I might have gone along with something I didn't want to do, and afterward, I would feel a deep sense of internal conflict for not having honored my own boundaries or stood up for myself in accordance with what I believe is right." And the discomfort that lingered following these experiences was echoed by others, with some women describing how failing to express their needs conflicted with their inner sense of right and wrong. According to one survivor, "There was a time I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I ignored my feelings to keep the peace, but it didn't sit right with me. I wanted to say something, to stand up for myself, but I didn't, and I still think about it." Another significant aspect of this theme was the loss of self-respect and disappointment survivors expressed in themselves. One woman reflected, "I told myself I would never put up with something that made me uncomfortable or less than I'm worth, but here I am, putting up with it, so to speak. It just is distressing overall that I don't have the courage to stand up and do something about it." Another one of the prominent themes that emerged across participant accounts was a deep and enduring sense of shame and self-blame following their experiences of coercion and abuse. As one participant noted, "I've been pressured to do things while being intimate that I didn't want to do, that completely went against my moral beliefs. Experiencing this has made me doubt my partner, has made me doubt myself. I think all the time, what the hell is wrong with me? Why do I allow this person to do these things to me? I feel ashamed and even embarrassed due to my experiences I have had in my current and previous relationships." In some cases, participants were able to articulate that even though they intellectually realized that they were not at fault, they often described still struggling emotionally with feelings that they could or should have done something differently. This woman said, "Even though I know logically it wasn't my fault, there are moments when my mind tells me I should have done something differently, like left sooner, fought harder, spoken up more. The shame creeps in when I start questioning myself, wondering if I let it happen in some way, even though I know it's not true." Several participants also expressed concern about how others might perceive their experiences or judge their responses to their abuse. "I felt shame when I first discovered I was a victim of domestic violence. Shame that it had happened to me, that I was in that situation, and shame about telling people because I knew many would say, 'Why hadn't I said anything sooner?' and not believe me." The third theme that emerged was of betrayal by others. And in this theme, participants described a deep sense of betrayal following experiences in which their partners violated their boundaries. These violations disrupted their sense of safety, their perceptions of the relationship, and in many cases, their ability to trust others in the future. The betrayal often left survivors feeling deceived and distressed, and several participants described how their understanding of their partner and sometimes the relationship itself shifted dramatically after realizing that someone they trusted had acted in ways that were fundamentally misaligned with their expectations. This woman said, "There was a night I said no, and he didn't stop. I just lay there, unsure whether to fight or let it happen. After, I stared at the ceiling, telling myself it didn't matter. We were married. But something changed. Every touch felt different, and he acted like nothing happened. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I just carried it." Participants also emphasized how the betrayal was not only about the act itself, but about the violation of intimacy, that being hurt by someone who knew them so well intensified the emotional damage. According to one survivor, When you trust someone, especially a partner, you don't expect them to hurt you like that. It wasn't just the physical part. It was the fact that they knew me, knew my vulnerabilities, and still chose to do something so violating. It made me question my ability to trust anyone, not just them. Others described how the betrayal shook their understanding of the relationship's foundation. When someone I was intimate with disregarded my boundaries and engaged in unwanted sexual acts, it felt like a profound violation of trust. They shattered my perception of the person I thought they were and made me question the authenticity of the entire relationship. And in some cases, the betrayal that survivors felt extended beyond the individual partner to include friends, institutions, or symptoms that failed to intervene or provide appropriate support. According to the survivor, the betrayal was profound. I trusted my partner completely, and their actions shattered that trust. I felt like everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. The betrayal wasn't just from my partner, it was also from a system that didn't seem to care or offer support. I felt let down and abandoned by those who were supposed to protect me. Finally, participants also described feeling dehumanized or objectified following their partner's betrayal. According to the survivor, he made me feel dirty and cheap, like he was paying me for sex, made me feel like I owed him. So, some takeaways of this research. First, over 80% of participants reported experiencing a morally injurious event related to an unwanted sexual experience within their current or former romantic relationship. And most of these survivors experienced severe or extreme impairment as a result. In addition, only shame-related moral injury mediated the relationship between intimate partner sexual violence and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, one possible explanation of this lies in the nature of and relational context of intimate partner sexual violence, which may blur the lines between the type of moral injury that is experienced. This finding aligns with betrayal trauma theory, which posits that survivors of abuse by close others may internalize blame and suppress awareness of the harm perpetrated against them in order to maintain the attachment to their perpetrator, a phenomenon that is known as betrayal blindness. Additionally, in the present study, the majority of our sample were either married or in a committed relationship. And given the time frame of the study, so all of these participants reported that they felt pressured, unsafe, or afraid during sex with their romantic partner within the past 12 months, it is likely based on that many survivors were still in a relationship with their abuser. Thus, the internalization that is inherent within this shame-related or self-directed moral injury may be especially psychologically burdensome for IPSV survivors, particularly those who are currently in the relationship with a coercive or abusive partner. Additionally, we have got a lot of interesting data that helps to explain why IPSV survivors are reporting moral injury. So qualitatively, these three themes that emerge from participants' responses: self-betrayal, self-blame, and other betrayal. These themes directly reflect symptoms and dimensions associated with moral injury and provide new and important insights into how moral injury is experienced by survivors of intimate partner sexual violence. In particular, the theme self-betrayal, participants described how feelings of profound internal conflict that arose from their perceived failure to uphold their personal values, often noting that they remained silent or compliant in order to preserve harmony in their relationship. Carol Gilligan, who's a famous and well-respected psychologist and philosopher, provides a potential framework for contextualizing these results of self-betrayal. And she argues that women and girls are often forced into a false choice between maintaining their voice, she means their moral clarity, their emotions, and their inner sense of justice, or preserving their relationships. And Gilligan describes this as a crisis of connection, in which women and girls are compelled to hide their authentic expressions in order to conform to social expectations. In doing so, she writes that these women and girls often experience a loss of voice because speaking up would jeopardize their belonging. In support of Gilligan's position, many survivors in our study reported avoiding confrontation or suppressing their preferences in order to maintain their relationship, thereby leading them to feel that they betrayed themselves. And this disorientation from oneself in order to preserve attachment may also help explain why shame-related moral injury emerged as a more robust predictor of PTSD symptoms in this sample. So some final takeaways and implications of the research we've discussed here today. First, experiences of intimate partner violence are linked to both types of moral injury, which in turn contribute to elevated psychological distress. These findings call for greater clinical recognition of moral injury in civilian survivors of IPV and to extend this research beyond military and healthcare contexts. In addition, some of the findings discussed today also indicate that religious survivors of intimate partner violence not only experience moral injury, but also experience struggles with their religion and spirituality. And given that prior research finds that co-occurring moral injury and religious struggles predict even greater adverse mental health outcomes, this is extremely concerning and points to the need for future research on why exactly IPV survivors are reporting elevated religious and spiritual struggles and factors that might protect against the development of these struggles. Additionally, I noted at the beginning of this presentation that there is still debate in the community as to the relevance of moral injury in cases of victimization and betrayal by others. I stated then that I believed this research would provide compelling evidence to the contrary. And frankly, after hearing the voices of these women, I would ask, if this isn't moral injury, then what is? Finally, to conclude here, it is my hope that we can use these women's stories to help, because they deserve more than just to be studied. They deserve to be heard, to be believed, and to be supported. So for those of us in research, I hope we can use this knowledge to develop and adapt interventions that address moral injury in the context of intimate partner violence. For those of us in clinical practice, I hope that we can integrate these findings into trauma-informed care that recognizes that the survivors may be experiencing extreme moral and spiritual distress. For those of us in chaplaincy or pastoral roles, I hope that we offer spiritually informed care that is grounded in compassion and understanding. And finally, for all of us, we are all friends, we are all family, neighbors, and community members. I hope that if and when we meet these survivors, that we can draw on what we know about how much they are suffering and use that knowledge to empathize with them, to truly listen to them, to mourn with them, and to support them however we can. Thank you all very much for listening. If you'd like to reach out, please email me at rachel@rachellkanter.com. And if you would like to scan any of the references, I have the QR code here, which you can scan that will let you see all of my references. Thank you all very much for listening.